Welcome to the Your Audio Solutions Podcast, episode 8. Almost reaching 10 episodes of this podcast. So thank you very much for listening so far, and I hope you have enjoyed it. Today we have the mastering engineer, actually Grammy award-winning mastering engineer, Brian Lucey, who's based in Los Angeles, where he's operating from his studio, Magic Garden Mastering. Brian has mastered hit records such as The Greatest Showman. He has worked with the Black Keys on Brothers, El Camino. He's done Ghost, Meliora, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, killer record, which I just listened to. It's awesome. Royal Blood and many other great artists. So check out his work if you haven't already heard it, which I think you have. In this interview with Brian, he's such a fascinating guy. I think you're gonna love listening to this interview. He has a lot of knowledge to share. And in this interview, we spoke about how he handled mistakes nowadays compared to when he started out, how he thinks about choices versus decisions, the fear of perfectionism, techniques you can use to become a better listener, how to use mastering references as a fence, which allows you to play and be free inside them, how it was being a student under Robert Fripp, who is the guy from King Crimson, and what he learned from that experience, how he found clients for his studio back in the 90s, how having a normal job helped him in the beginning of his career, and why he recommended you get a side job too, how he was driven by not being successful but for his passion for sound, and why you need to be patient. And I think this is really helpful and valuable to people in my age, and older, younger, late 20s, early 20s, early 30s maybe. So why you need to be patient with your craft and why it takes longer than you think to succeed. That's some really good stuff. Also how he is running his studio and business nowadays, and why being a mastering engineer in this era is like being an emergency room doctor. As you learn more about that, also his favorite failures and much more. I think you're gonna love this conversation, listening to it. I know I enjoyed talking to him. But before we get into the conversation with Brian Lucey, I want to tell you about a free guide you can download right now. And it's called 3 Tested Ways to Increase Your Client Base. And I made this guide for people who either have a home studio or work in a professional studio but want to increase their client base. And also for people whose technical skills are already up to par and you have already spent your whole life making music, but the only thing that's missing is the clients. Or if you have finished your college degree and are looking to get your foot in the door in a recording studio. In this guide, I will show you the email I use to contact bands online and how I have built relationships with people in the music industry that has given me a lot of paid work. I will show you the best way of getting repeat customers, and I will show you a technique I use to get work in recording studios, which is perfect if you're just starting out. Check this free guide out by using the link below. I think you will love it and find it very useful. But now, over to Brian Lucey. So I think it would be perfect to start the podcast with this quote I heard you saying. It might have been from Robert Fripp, the guitar player from King Crimson, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And it was, if we don't know where we're going, we will probably get there.
Yeah, that's an almost direct quote from Robert. Yes.
Yeah, so I heard you say that. Just could you let us know what that quote means to you and how has it affected your life, I guess?
Well, for me, that really speaks to the the nature of a creative life, versus, for example, a business life. So we can kind of do the opposite. Like in business, you have a business plan, you have everything sort of on a 1 year, 5 year, 10 year. There's a lot of knowns, and you try to use the knowns against the unknowns to kind of manifest results, and that's a business plan. And a creative life doesn't really work quite that way in my experience. And so I in my opinion, I think that's what he was talking about. In a creative life, it's a little bit more like the famous Steve Jobs Stanford commencement speech, which some of your folks may have heard or they may have not, but it's worth listening to. I think Steve Jobs was talking about what Robert was talking about, but in his own way. And he was saying how his parents really, he was adopted and they really wanted to go to college, and so he went to college, but then he dropped out, and then he was just there, and he thought, well, maybe I'll take a calligraphy class, and he took that because the school he was at was really good at calligraphy, and next thing you know, we have fonts and a whole world of things in computers because he dropped out of school that his parents made him go to and took calligraphy. So in my language, I sort of look at it like in any given moment we have options, and those options are assessed, and you make a choice, and then you're in a different place, and you're in a different moment, and then you have options, and then those options are assessed, and you make a choice, and this just goes on and on and on. And what Steve Jobs was saying in his thing was that when he looks back at his life 20 years on, at this point, of course, he thought he was going to live. He thought he'd beaten cancer, but he didn't make it much longer. But when he was looking back on his life, he said, in a sense, how did I get here? It kind of makes perfect sense. But you couldn't have planned it that way, because you had to take each moment, look at your options, make your choice, move into that moment, look at your options, make your choice, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that's what Robert's saying. If we don't know where we're going, we'll probably get there. You could look at Steve Jobs' life and you could say there's an example of someone who did that. For creative people, it's very much like that. Like what I'm doing. If we're going to start quoting Robert, he's got a bunch of good ones. I can throw out another.
Sure.
The future presents itself, and this is paraphrasing, but the future presents itself with two kind of qualities. One is it's inevitable, and the other is that it's a surprise. So it's sort of like, gee, how did I get here? How on earth did this happen? And on the other hand, it's like, oh gosh, well, I guess this was what was going to happen. This was like the inevitable thing to happen. And when you have those two kind of qualities of surprise and inevitability, then it's kind of real, So for myself, like my mastering life falls under that category. If it's not something I ever intended to do, it's not something I ever said I want to do, it's not something I ever said I really need to do until I needed to do it, which was part of my own creative process. Back in the 90s, it wasn't like it is now. In the 90s, if you wanted to record at home, you had to have analog gear. Maybe you had ADAT machines, but you're talking about console, outboard gear, etc. There was very little digital recording. There was, the consumer stuff was DATs and ADATs, but, we weren't in the, in the box era that we're in now that we sort of take for granted. It's fairly new on the landscape, right? So when I was recording in the 90s, I started recording out of necessity. Hey, we can keep quoting Robert. Honor necessity, honor sufficiency. Right? What do you need and how much is enough? Right. So those two things right there is pretty much all anyone needs to live by. Really, you could just stop right there with the quoting. Honor necessity, honor sufficiency. What's really needed? How much is enough? That's my interpretation of that. So I needed in '94 to make a decision. I had to either quit recording, or I had to teach myself how to do it, because the people I could afford to pay at the time, $25 to $50 an hour, sadly, not too different than it is today for a lot of people. But at the time I had to make that decision because I was unhappy with the results of what I was paying for. So I made the decision to teach myself how to record in an era where nobody really did that too much. You basically got an internship. Maybe you went to a school, but there weren't very many of them. But you probably wanted to get an internship and work at a studio so you could really learn the craft of tracking or mixing or mastering. You'd want to get it from somebody who really knew what they were doing. We're in a very different era now, but I didn't do that. I didn't do the era we're in now because I didn't have it available. I didn't have the information. And I didn't do the era that I was in then, which was to get, an internship. I basically just said, screw it. I'm going to buy a bunch of stuff and figure this out. And I don't recommend that. I mean, it worked for me, but it wouldn't necessarily be my first choice for everyone. But it was what I needed at the time. I either needed to stop recording or I needed to figure out how to do it myself. So mastering came at the end of that process, where I would send out to mastering, and again in the late 90s, your mastering options on the low end was like $100 a song. And it was a guy I won't mention. There were a few guys like this, but you send it off, you get it back, and it was basically a couple of Weiss EQs and maybe some Genelec 1031s, in their home studio. And it was a third or a fourth or whatever of the price of, maybe Bob Ludwig or someone like this, or the guys at Sterling or at Metropolis in UK, or whoever was the high end. I forget who was the high end pricing at that time. Anyway, so I didn't know anything about mastering. I just didn't like what I got back, So I started recording because I didn't like what I could afford, and I started mastering because I didn't like what I could afford. And so it was really a necessity-based decision as an artist. I was an artist. I was making music. Recording was a necessity. It was like a necessary evil, if you will. And say not evil for the non-English speakers. I don't mean it like Satan. I'm just saying like a pain in the ass thing that you did. I didn't take it on as some sort of a beautiful art form with a glorious history and incredible amounts of blood, sweat, and tears and deep techniques and all the respect I have for the crafts of tracking, mixing, mastering, those three distinct crafts. All the respect I have for those now, I didn't have then. It was just something you had to do. As an artist, you had to do it. In the world we're in today, people are not so different than I was then. They're like, oh, I'll figure it out myself. Well, it's a pretty steep learning curve. Let me just warn you, folks. Anyway, so I taught myself mastering just the way I taught myself recording, just the way I taught myself how to play guitar when I was a kid, like many of us did, little white kids in the suburbs playing blues, a common story. And so necessity was really the guide of that. And so for me, when I got into it, it took maybe 10 years to figure out that mastering was really what I was meant to do. Like that was what I was born to do. That's the right gig for me. And something that was never on my radar for, at this point, like 2/3 of my life or something, and more than half of my life. Thought about it. Now it's everything that I do. And I let go of everything else that I thought I would always do. When we're young, we think, oh, I'm this person, I'm that person, or I'm going to always do this, or I'm going to always do that. And maybe that's true, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, exactly. You just got to be open to, as we said in the beginning, to what can happen, I guess, and follow that path.
Yeah, I mean, I had a girlfriend, when she was 5 years old, she knew she wanted to be a veterinarian. She's a veterinarian, and she's a really good one, and her husband's a veterinarian, and they're like the kings of their college and da 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 da. But that's not everybody, So in the creative life, it's really more about where am I? What are my options? We make choices, and we try not to get too bogged down with the choices because life is about learning. So a lot of times, I'll fall into this. A lot of people do. You'll look at a choice and think of it in a real heavy way. So I'm going to use a semantic distinction here, an English language semantic distinction. If you think of it as a decision, to me, that's very heavy. A choice is lighter. So like, I have a big decision to make. That sounds it sounds a little steep, It sounds like it's a little scary. There could be serious repercussions. If you say, well, I'm making a choice, like you're choosing between red and orange or blue or teal, it's like there's something lighter to it for me. So I use those distinctions, choice and decision. I try not to use the word decision too much because I think it is a heavy word. But the choices we make, they all have repercussions, certainly, but the whole point in life is learning from mistakes. So fearing mistakes is just a prison. That's like guilt, shame, sort of the Judeo-Christian world that many of us are born into, where we're supposed to. It's bullshit. We're born with potential, and the only way we're going to get to any piece of our potential is to make choices and learn from them. Some of them aren't going to be great choices, and that's okay. Because if you don't make a mistake, you can't learn from it. Which brings up Robert again. Let's bring Robert back in. So, as Robert would say, there's no mistake. There is no mistake, save for one, the failure to learn from a mistake.
Right. Yeah. It's super good advice, to be honest, because as you said, mistakes is how you learn, but it can also be hard to learn that. It can be hard to learn that you have to learn from failures, whatever you want to call it. That's not easy.
Yeah. Well, it's a fear-based world. If you're in the Western world, if it's a Judeo-Christian kind of world, even if you're in India, there's a lot of cultures that are very shame, guilt, and fear-oriented, where people are not really encouraged to live life this way. So to me, it's like, what you say is very smart. You have to be at a certain kind of peace with yourself to step into the void of potentially making a mistake. But you do that if you're in a good place. You do that knowing, well, you can correct it. Course correction is life. So, again, there are always repercussions, and the more problematic the thing we step into, the more repercussions there are. Which again, you've got Robert in my head now, so I'm trying to think. He's got a good one on this. We've got like 3 versions. Let me think. There's the necessary, unnecessary, and extraneous. Is that what it was? I'm thinking out loud here. Sorry. Necessary mistakes, unnecessary mistakes, and extraneous. That's not. I can't attribute that to him, but the concept applies, where the further we get off of the path of our own necessary mistakes, things you have to do to learn, things get really dangerous and expensive and problematic. We can get into some pretty bad places. But normal life is full of choices, and some of them we would consider a mistake, and we learn from it, and we go on, and hopefully we don't repeat it. And of course we do. We all repeat mistakes. It takes 2, it takes 4, it takes 6. But again, we're trying to keep it to a minimum, and we're trying to learn.
Yeah. So how do you handle mistakes, let's say, nowadays compared to when you just started out?
Well, that's a good question. I don't really see. The only mistakes that I make day to day are, like, I sent the wrong file, or I didn't read the email and I used the wrong mix. Like, that's an actual mistake. It's like a factual, provable mistake, right? Oh, sorry, I screwed that up. Let me apologize. Let me fix it right away. Boom, boom, boom. So that's the world of mistakes for me. I'm human. I screw up. Everybody does. The other world of mistakes to me isn't really mistakes, because it's a creative art. It's very subjective. And my thing is, like, you send me something, I send you something back, and then if you love it, great. Today, 12-song record, perfect. But tomorrow, maybe 3-song EP, total fail. Maybe, we really wanted it, brighter or louder or whatever. Who knows? So the point for me is just to make sure that everything I send out is musical and cool in some way. Because what you're trying to do as an engineer is keep people's confidence. right? You don't have to win, by being perfect or by hitting the target. You don't have to do that every time, because you can't do that every time. Nobody does that. The top mixers in the world, nobody nails it first try every time. So what do we need to do if that's not the standard, right? So the standard is we need to send something that resonates musically, because it is musical, because it is alive, but it may not be what they had in mind. So someone says, oh, that's really cool, but I was thinking of this. And if you don't do that, then people lose confidence. And that's problematic. We don't want people to lose confidence, because in creativity, confidence is kind of at a premium anyway. Everyone's on the verge of thinking, oh, I suck, or this song is terrible, or I'm a bad mixer, or, artists most of all, maybe, tremendous amounts of insecurity are part and parcel of the world of creativity, right? It's a subjective sport. We don't know. And even the most successful people will have, they'll have lots of issues around insecurity. So as an engineer, we're trying to do what we can to maintain confidence in the other party. And the way that we do that is to make sure that we seem competent. Well, how do we seem competent? Well, I've already said we're going to make mistakes, right? I might send the wrong file, or I might, mislabel the DDP track, or I might do some, technical error. We already do that, so let's just write that off. That's going to happen. Let's keep it to a minimum. It's going to happen. So what's really the place where we can put our effort into keeping the confidence of the client? And the answer is that just the musical values need to be there. People need to be excited, even if it isn't what they wanted. They need to feel confident that you can get them where they need to go. So I go about my work in a fairly free state of mind, because I've learned over time, and this is just me, it may not be everybody, but I've learned that people like me to do what I do. Like not everybody, but they generally want me to kind of do my thing first, and then they'll kind of rein it in, as opposed to, sending me like an exact ref of something to copy or whatever, which I think is kind of dumb, because you can't copy anything anyway. So fortunately, I get people who are like open-minded, and they're like, yeah, just go for it, because they know that my process is that I can easily revise whatever I did. So I basically live in a fairly free place, and I look to free up others. So for example, if people say to me, oh, will you take a listen and give me notes? I say no. I'm 100% opposed, in principle and in practice, to mastering engineers giving notes to mixers. Why is that? Well, any note that we give is going to be a technically oriented note. Like the snare drum being thin and loud might sound weird to me on par of 1,000 songs, but it might be perfect for you as an artist and your song. And so the creative signature of a track in practical terms is far more valuable than a good mix, whatever we think is a good mix. The creative signature of the artist and the signature of the mixer, something juicy and exciting and unique and authentic, is far more valuable, holistically valuable to the people making it, and commercially valuable to the people listening, and spiritually valuable to the people listening. Authenticity and uniqueness is way more valuable than making sure that snare isn't too loud or something like that. So mastering engineers giving notes is just leading people towards the path of mediocrity, in my opinion. Oops, that was my phone. Turn that off. So mediocrity is being safe. Mediocrity is being average. Mediocrity is being, if it's my job as the mastering engineer to take any crazy mix that you like and make it work for the world. That's a mastering job. It's not a mixer's job to make it work for the world. So mixers need to be doing everything they can to make the mix speak for the artist and be emotionally compelling and have momentum. Not so it doesn't die after the second chorus. There always needs to be momentum. There needs to be a composition of faders, panning, distortion. Mixing is a compositional sport, much like music. So all of that is the job of the mixer. I tell people, do everything you can to get it where you want to get it, except the volume. Don't worry about the volume, because that's a fear-based issue on the part of the mixer. And I can make anything loud enough. If the guy can't make anything loud enough, they're not very good. So I encourage a freedom, a creative, free mindset in the part of mixers as well, because this idea of mistakes and the crippling nature of perfectionism can really get in people's way, and it does. We all struggle with it. We want to be good enough. So our definition of good or good enough is usually when we're starting out, and I don't know who your audience is, but when people are new, it's hard to get past the idea of being afraid to fail or afraid of something, and to move into the idea of what really is the right thing for this project and what feels good, subjectively. The place to be objective is in monitoring. And this is an area, I have to mention in our short time here, because, monitoring is the easiest thing to take for granted, because we've all heard stories of how such and such mixed such and such on such and such a shitty speaker in such and such a shitty room. And our ego wants to say, oh, I can learn my speaker, I can learn my room, da-da-da-da-da. Well, that's ego. Physics says otherwise. Physics is real, okay? And our ego is in flux. It misleads us. So I encourage people to be very interested in the technical elements of their mixing situation, their room treatments, their monitoring, and then to get very interested in their mental framework, what I call their frame of reference, meaning to have a bunch of tracks that kind of define the edges of what's acceptable. Like, this one's loud, but it's cool. This one's dynamic, but it's cool. This has a loud vocal, but it's okay. This is a buried vocal, but it's okay. This vocal is sibilant. This vocal is not. Production refs describe the target. It's like, oh, I like the bass drum. Oh, I like that snare drum. Oh, I like that slap delay. That's a production ref. It's a target. A mastering ref is the edge of the fence. But as a mixing engineer, it's nice to do a little of that mastering thinking when you're setting up the room, to try and get yourself in a room where your automatic, intuitive decisions have some kind of basis in physics and reality.
Right. Yeah. So get some measures and.
Yeah, just get your room in the ballpark and get yourself to know your room, so that and you can work around that by just having some ref tracks that are in your genre of what you're mixing, and you throw them into your session, listen to them for 5 minutes, and then turn them off. Don't refer to them all day, because that's crippling. You can never copy anything. Don't try, but just get yourself in the ballpark of what's about right, and then go from there. So as a mastering engineer, I would rather have quote unquote shitty mixes that are musically interesting, that are artistically interesting, that are creative mixes that have life to them, than mixes that are just gone over and over and over to the point where they are fear-based, perfected, and all the life is kind of taken out of them.
Right. Yeah, it makes total sense, man.
Yeah, so that was a long answer, but the idea of mistakes and perfectionism and all that's kind of it's a big topic for me, because that's where you can really make some real progress, or you can really cut yourself off at the knees.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, because you mentioned a lot of interesting things, but one of them being like the fear of perfectionism, because that's something I have seen many people, suffer from. And do you have any tips or things you have done to get out of a state, if you've been in such a state?
A state of being like afraid while working?
Yeah,
or
like, oh, this is not
perfectionism.
perfect. Yeah, perfectionism. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I ever fear when I'm working is I just fear that I'm not doing my best. I think that's the only legitimate fear. You want to do your best. You don't want to shortchange yourself, your client, the artist, the world at large. You're sitting down to do this thing. Give it your best. Now, what does that mean? That's what we're really talking about. What is giving my best, and what happens when giving it my best turns into a fearful, perfectionistic kind of exercise, right? That's what we're saying. So I think it's more about just understanding conceptually where the line is. So, for example, if you're worried as a mixer, let's say you got a 5-song thing or 10-song thing, if you're worried about consistency between tracks, that's a no-no. That's perfectionism. That's my job. Your job is to make individual tracks that each have their own unique voice. And actually, the more interesting the record is, the more interestingly diverse the singles are. So don't start mastering and mixing by looking at homogenizing things or looking at getting the levels up where they need to be. So conceptually, if you find yourself going into those two areas, that's a fear-based, perfectionistic-based concept, but it's simply not your job. So my answer to your question is really more along the lines of defining what the boundaries are for what a mixer is and what a mixer isn't. Right? You have to know when to let go. You let go, and then you pass it on to someone like myself who can actually enhance it, not disappoint you, but actually thrill you with something beyond where you were. And in order to do that, obviously you got to find the right person, but that's what you're looking for. You're not looking to be a control freak mixer. I mean, there are a lot of control freak mixers that are well known. I'll skip their name, but I can guarantee you that if they just took a little bit of that limiter off, or a little bit of that hyper compression, if they just, we're talking a dB or two, if they just let it breathe a little bit because they let go of their fear, someone like myself can make that way better than what they had done. So that's not to say that limiting and compression is not a huge part of mixing, and a lot of people do a wonderful job. I mean, one of my favorite clients, Chad Blake, uses 4 limiters on the 2 mix. So you can, if you're good, you can do anything. But I'm just talking about the psychological position of trying to over control or being afraid. So there's just things to not be afraid of. Being loud enough is not a thing to be afraid of. What you want to do is make sure that your dynamics move from section to section appropriate for the genre. So again, you got a few refs in there, different people. You're listening to the dynamic motion from part to part. You're like, okay, I kind of feel with my body. We're not measuring it. We're just kind of feeling it. We're listening. And we can talk about how to listen better. We can do that as a part of this answer. But you go back to your mix, and your mix is a lot quieter, but it can still move dynamically with the same kind of degree or level of motion from section to section, and it can still make sure to never lose momentum. Production is really the art of momentum, arrangement, production. You start off with a thing, you add a thing, in comes a chorus, then you drop out, and you can't lose everything. You got another verse, and you bring in another thing in the verse, and then now another thing in the second chord. So all along, it's a little tease, it's a call and response, it's all the elements of composition within production and mixing, right? So those are the rightful things to be doing. The wrong things are, it's not going to be loud enough in the end, or I got to make sure I put in, as a mixer, I got to make sure I leave in all these stereo tracks, stuff like that. No, you don't have to do that. You can cut out half the overhead track, go mono. You can cut out half the keyboard, go mono. You have liberties. Mixers with skill take liberties because they're really just interested in the exciting result, not just overly respecting the source material. And the same goes with EQing. I'm just going to do a little here, I'm going to do a little there. Like, maybe a little is perfect, Or maybe you should just, ratchet hack the shit out of it with 2 filters, top and bottom, and some distortion in the middle. So it's this interesting balance, because what we do is a service job, and we want to be respectful. By the same token, we can't be too respectful, and we can't let service become slavery. We can't be burdened by fear of stepping on things from the past that we were handed, and we can't be burdened by fear of never getting to the finish line, so then we cripple the mastering person. It's this kind of and it takes time, right? It's easy to talk about. I've done it for decades. If you're listening, it's going to take time. And you've got to kind of learn how to balance where to be conservative and where to be liberal with your choices. Where to be respectful and where to be disrespectful. And that's a thing that takes the time.
Yeah, exactly, man. You mentioned how to listen better. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah. So the really big tool in the whole sport of production is listening. Kind of obvious, but I'm going to state it because it's easy to skip the obvious. We all kind of assume we're good listeners, and again, that's kind of the ego talking. We could be better listeners. I'm always looking to be a better listener, and I'm considered a pretty good listener by friends, clients in the world, but I'm always looking to be a better listener. And so we can all be better listeners. And so how do we go about doing that? Well, a few things come to mind that might be helpful for people. One of them is to just practice really kind of doing nothing. What some people call meditation is a complicated word. It's heavy. But if you just sit for 10 minutes a day and don't do anything, and just let your mind go where it goes, and just try to be comfortable. If something will bother your shoulder or whatever, if you can just sit for 10 or 20 minutes a day and do nothing, you'll be surprised how valuable that becomes into when you go to do something. And it might sound a little bit like double talk, but it's really not, because when we can sit and do nothing for 10, 20 minutes, or I used to do 30 minutes a day for kind of years on end, maybe 5 days a week, but when we get a sense of stillness, or when we increase our sense of stillness in ourself, we're really much better able to perceive the outside world. And listening is perception. It's one of our things. We see, we smell, we taste, we touch. So listening when we're busy all the time, particularly in the world we're in now, which is social media, computer driven, online, it's very mental, right? We're in a very mental world. So listening becomes very mental. We don't even know it, but I can guarantee you that most people are listening are mental listeners more than they are emotional listeners, and more than they are physical listeners. Most people in this era are. And what we really want is a balance. We want to listen emotionally, we want to listen physically. Well, what do I mean by that? What am I talking about? Well, let's look at physical listening. So if you're able to sit for 10 minutes a day and do nothing, and then you go in the studio and you put on some reference material, something you know well, something you've heard a lot, I guarantee you'll hear it differently. In the same way that if you put up some bass traps and increased your room, I guarantee you would hear it differently. You're going to hear it better. So the technical side of the bass trap is sort of equal to the inner work, personal side of making yourself a better conduit for listening. So let's say we're listening to this thing we've heard a million times. We've sat for 10 or 20 minutes and done nothing. Our thoughts wander, whatever. We get uncomfortable, but just set the clock. Okay, 20 minutes. We go. We hit play. We listen. Now what I want you to do is to feel the vibration of this thing you've heard 100 times. Feel that vibration hit your chest. Feel it hit your legs. Feel it all the way down to your toes. Listen with your whole body to something that you think you know well. And see how it feels. See how it physically feels. Because listening is a whole body experience. And a good listener has a good vehicle for listening with their body. In other words, they're relaxed. They're not completely mental. There's a you know, the old myth of like the coffee-driven studio engineer. Okay, you can live like that. It's been done for decades. You can smoke and drink and burn the midnight oil and do all that. I personally don't do that, and I don't recommend it. I think we're in a different era, and the whole sport has evolved. And I think where you want to be now is a more healthy, holistic thing where you take care of yourself, and you come in and you listen as more of a little bit of a cleaner channel, a little bit more of a more transparent vessel for feeling it. So when we listen with our whole body, we notice that, you know, the frequencies all have a beat. You know, they have a pulse. You know, it's not just 440 and 220 and 110. That translates to the body. You can feel it. So when I'm listening to music and I'm making mastering decisions, I'm not just listening with my ears and my head. I'm listening with my legs and my feet. I'm listening. I'm watching my body. Does it make my toe tap at that tempo? Does it make the hair on my arm stand up? Do things happen to me physically by virtue of what decisions I've made? Things that tell me it's good. Right? So it's not all just mental. Because the thing with the mind is it's easy to trick the mind. You know, we all are very mental creatures, and we're in a very mental modern computer era, as I said before. But we're still just animals. And we do most of our decision making from, you know, not super rational places. We rationalize it, and we say it was a mental thing, but it probably wasn't. It was probably emotional, or it might have been physical. Some might have felt good, or it might have felt good emotionally. So I encourage people to use their whole body to listen, and the way to do that is to chill out. You know, to do some things to just not come in stressed, tired. You know, thought, coffee, cigarette, mental.
Mm-hmm. So would you recommend to someone who wants to learn this to take 10, 20 minutes, meditate, then listen to a song or two, and then make some notes of what they felt, or just start working straight after?
Yeah, I mean, if you can, it's harder than it sounds. If even 10 minutes a day, to stop and do nothing for 10 minutes a day is actually very hard. But if you do it for long enough, a day is good, a week is better, a month is better, a year is better. If you do it for a while, and there are other kinds of meditation. I'm not actually saying meditation, because that has, you know, there's TM, transcendental meditation, which is really good. That's David Lynch's thing. There's Ringo's thing. Which those are good.
Do, if I can ask?
I don't anymore. I don't have to do it because I've kind of got it in my body. But I used to do what we did with Robert Fripp in Guitar Craft, which he called the practice of doing nothing. The practice of doing nothing was literally just sitting there and doing nothing. And of course, your brain still works, right? Your brain always works. Your thoughts happen when you're asleep, when you're awake, when you're sitting in a chair doing nothing. But what you do is you start to just observe the thoughts go by, sort of like clouds, and you're like, oh, okay, I'm thinking that. Oh, I'm thinking that now. And you're not just caught up in every thought. You know, again, the modern world, it pushes all of our energy up into our head and into our eyes, where we look at the screen and we look at details and we look at letters and fonts, and so I'm encouraging people to get down into their feet. You know, take the energy from your head, and don't turn off your head. You can't do it. That'd be kind of dumb. It's good to be smart. We like smart, but I'm talking about smart that extends down into your toes, all the way down through your whole body. So listening from that place, it will improve over time. Your listening will improve because your whole body is present, and there's kind of proof for this. Like if you've ever had a flavor, like I don't know what you like, ice cream, shrimp, steak, fish. Think of a flavor like when you were a kid 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. If you had that flavor again, or the smell's a strong one. You smell a thing and you remember exactly what it was across decades. Could be decades if you're old enough. So that's the body memory, right? Whereas like mentally, you can start A-Bing and flipping switches, and your head starts spinning. You don't know what you just heard. So the body has real long-term kind of memory, wisdom, longevity in it. So if we can get our listening to be down so the vibrations of music end up being felt as vibrations in the body, we'll just make better choices, and we'll be a better, a sort of a more transparent or neutral vehicle for interpreting what we're hearing.
Yeah, exactly, man.
This makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing I thought about is as part of that is another good listening skill is to A/B compare things, like with a friend. So now in the era we're in now, you've got A/B on your EQ. It's like very easy to A/B. It's almost too easy. So I'm gonna give you like an A/B that's harder, and I encourage people to try to find a more challenging A/B that can't be done instantaneously, like clicking on a screen, and then do it with a friend and compare notes. So this is another really good technique. So what would be an example? An example would be changing out tubes in a guitar amplifier, or changing out speakers in an amplifier, or changing the amplifier with a pair of passive speakers in your studio. Something along those lines that's physical and requires more than a 1 second click to do the A/B, right? So like scientific theory would say, well, this is worthless, it's too long of a gap, it's not an instantaneous ABX, right? My friend Ethan Weiner and I could argue about this for a day,
Right.
but because I have better things to do, and so does he.
Yeah.
He would say, this is dumb. Well, it's not dumb at all. When you can be physically chill, let's say you're changing out speakers. Okay, you've got a Fender Twin, and it's got a couple of, stock speakers, and you're going to put in a couple of Alnico Blues, or you're going to throw in a couple of greenbacks or something like this. It's going to take you 5 or 10 minutes. You got to unscrew, you got to reconnect, you got to turn it back on, let the tubes warm up. So during that time, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to be quiet. You and your friend are going to work together as a team. And before you do the swap, you're going to have like something you can repeat, where you're going to play A, and you're going to play G, and maybe you're going to hit a pedal, and you're going to play A, and you're going to play G, and you're going to set up your A/B with something repeatable with your hands. And then you're going to be real chill. You're going to turn off the amp, do the swap, plug it all back in, breathe, don't talk, just breathe gently, work quickly but not rushing, turn the amp back on, play your A, play your G, play your A, play your G, and then you stop, and then you talk about it. Say, well, what did you hear? Well, what did you hear? Okay, so this has a lot of good qualities to it. One is it's over a long period of time. 2 is it requires you to be really chill while you're doing it. 3 is you have someone there who's going to have a different opinion, or maybe the same opinion. And if it's a friend that you know well over time, a trusted friend like that can really help you to, kind of clarify quickly what you both think is there, or just say, well, we have different tastes, so we hear different things. But if you do this kind of physical A/Bing, and you can do it alone too. You don't have to have a friend. I mean, I've done it alone countless times. It's more fun with a friend, but if you do it alone, it's the same thing. It's just be quiet. Do it in a quiet time of night. Do it when you're uninterrupted. Turn off your phone. Don't look at Facebook. Don't do Instagram. Don't do anything. Just, set up the A/B, swap out the physical changes, play the B thing, whatever the B is, hit play or hit the guitar chord or whatever. And that's a very challenging but very informative A/Bing, and that's a really good way to learn how to listen. You do a bunch of that, and you start to get a sense of being able to trust yourself on what you really hear. And being able to trust ourselves is really, really important. It's tricky, but it's really important. So that's another way. And then another way I alluded to earlier, is to have a frame of reference of songs that describe the fence of your experience. In other words, not production songs. Production refs are targets. I like the vocal, I like the bass, I like the kick. I want to make my vocal, my bass, my kick sound sort of like that. Okay, that's a production ref. But a mastering ref is an overview ref. It's defining the edges of the fence so that you can play and have fun and feel free on the inside of the fence. So I encourage everyone to have their own, you don't have to use mine because mine wouldn't matter to you, but for yourself, come up with 12 tracks, 6 that have 2 extremes, each one. Low end, big low end, bright, loud, sibilant, whatever. Have an extreme. And so those 12 reference tracks, you can always just throw them in your session and click through them real quick, 5 seconds each one, the start of every day. And that starts to give you also a sense of a frame of reference. And also over days, you'll notice that you hear them differently every day. You hear it differently every day. Why? Because you're different every day. And over time, you won't hear them differently. But some days you will. Some days you will. You're never going to be totally consistent. But you can learn to trust your hearing by listening repeatedly to the same thing and observing how different it seems, right? Because it didn't change. That file is that file. But if it seems different to you, then it's you. And then that's very interesting. It's interesting to observe ourselves and to question and to study that. So there's a few ideas on how to listen more.
So you mean those 12 songs, for example, would be the fences, right? If I understood it correctly. Yeah.
Correct.
Cool. Yeah, that's really cool. Some cool ideas, man. Definitely going to try them out. And I hope the listeners can do the same. Awesome. Also, I'd like to, because obviously you started mastering. That was not your first gig or thing you did in music, obviously, because you guitar player. You said you studied with, again, Robert Fripp in the 90s, right?
Yes.
So how was that whole 90s for you? I'd love to hear more about your experience in the 90s, because that's where everything took shape, it seems like.
Well, I mean, kind of. I mean, I started playing guitar when I was a kid, and I was like 11, and when I was 18, it was in the late 80s, and I was in New York City, and I got a gig playing like 6 nights a week. I played electric guitar in this band, these Irish guys, and so it was kind of mostly covers, and they needed somebody to play leads, and I was there, and I just fell right into it. So I was playing, kind of, I mean, it was a cover band, but it was a professional gig. It was a full-time gig. I was like, I guess 19. And then coming out of that, I came back to Ohio. I played a little bit. I was going to college a little bit, but when you play music 6 nights a week, it really gets under your skin. It's hard to do much else when you've had such a close experience with the energy of music. Music is a life-changing energy, and when it hits you, it hits you. And if that's something you got to do, then you got to do it. And then you start to figure out how to get your life arranged so that you can do music, because it's like you can't live without it. And that was my experience. So I ended up finding the Guitarcraft thing just because we were listening to the League of Gentlemen, and it was vinyl, and we were listening to a record called Let the Power Fall, which is one of the early tape loop albums, where actually Robert and Brian Eno kind of invented looping. 2 Revox tape machines turned on their side, they would run a loop of tape, and really ambient music kind of came out of Eno and Fripp. But anyway, so I was listening to that stuff, and then I started going to these seminars, and we did the practice of doing nothing. We did a lot of guitar playing, but we did a lot of other things, just making food for each other and cleaning the toilets and the non-glamorous elements, much like you have with an internship, which again they aren't available anymore. But in a strange way, it was kind of like a studio internship, but there was no studio involved. It was more of a musician internship. Taking the glamour out of being a musician and just making it a very day-to-day nuts and bolts activity, and coming out of that, I just started playing with an original band, and like I say, fell into recording because I had 2 choices. I could stop recording because I hated it. I hated what I could afford, or I could figure out how to do it. So, at the time I had a very inexpensive house. I think my house was like $53,000, and I had a job that allowed me to buy a house, which was kind of a big deal compared to my peers. and that allowed me to take on a bunch of debt. So I had like a $53,000 house and about 35 grand in credit card debt at one point, and it just kept going from there, where I would buy new things, and it was the hardware era, so you had to A/B everything, kind of the way I've described. You had to do a physical A/B, which I think is actually very advantageous. The era we're in now is so great in so many ways, but like anything in life, there's always a downside. And the instantaneousness of loading in your plugins and hitting Control S to save it and all that, the quickness of all of that is actually keeping people from a lot of the learning stages in how to listen and how to trust themselves. It's in a sense too easy at this point. So in that era, we did a lot of physical A/B-ing and testing and with friend or friends, and and it was like it was festive, it was celebratory. Like, oh, let's try this EQ, let's do this EQ versus this one. It was before you had a YouTube tutorial where someone else did it. You had to do it, right? The YouTube tutorial exists because people like me were doing that in the 90s. So when it was all hardware, you were doing all this stuff in a physical domain, and that was stretching, increasing our ability to listen. Kind of in the ways I described before. So, I can only teach what I know. There's a lot of other ways to learn to listen, and there's a lot of other ways to think about life, and but I can only go by my experience and what I know. And so for me, the examples I gave in terms of how to listen better is just an offshoot of what we did, back in the era that was the only thing you could do. And then through the 2000s, I was mastering, I was mixing, I was producing, I was musicianing, and then over time, just mastering, took over. Obviously, the last 15 years has been a whole lot of my records in the world, and I'm very fortunate, that happened. And I don't, I've got some of my instruments still. I've got most of my guitars, and sometimes I'll play. I've got a buddy that's a TV composer, and he comes over every couple months, and we improvise. And because he works on the grid every day, with a tempo map, and I work in the mastering studio every day. So we like to just, fuck around.
Yeah, sure, man.
That's really fun.
But so when you did start out your studio, how did you go about back then to find clients to come and record? Was it through your musician connection, or how did you build it?
People knew me as a musician, and so I would get, I had respect and I had referral that way. And so, but in the beginning, now I don't know how anyone would do it now. It's a difficult era because, everybody wants to do the gig now. It's tough. I feel for everybody trying to get going at the moment. But for myself, it was, you do it for friends and do it for yourself, and then maybe you could get somebody to pay you for it.
So did having a job help you, as in you weren't under, big stress to get clients?
Yes. That's a great question, and it's a huge part of my ability to be able to do what I do now, was that I developed my skills, if you will, without the pressure of making money from doing it. I developed it kind of in a vacuum, and I developed it to a place where it had value, and then people saw that and they were like, "Oh, I want what you're doing." So the downside of needing to make money right away from anything is that you are at the bottom of the ladder, whatever is your ladder, and so you are only going to be useful to someone else further up the ladder to alleviate their burden. So inevitably, you're a cog in their wheel. Now, this can work if it's a good wheel, and if you know when to get off and to do your own thing, when you know when to leave. The problem is that a lot of people never leave, or they get stuck kind of in one way of thinking with that person. So again, nothing's perfect. There's no one way to do any of this, but for me, it was just self-taught, and then people would come in, and over the years, I had to just learn that really what people wanted from me was to do, kind of what I would do if I didn't worry or fear that I was doing too much. Like they wanted me to do my thing. I mean, the last time that I was conservative about something I sent out was like 4 or 5 years ago. I did a track that was I think it was Andy Wallace mixed it, and I'd known Andy's name forever and had a great respect for his name, and so I kind of went into a little bit of a shell, and I was like, oh well, I'm not gonna like shit all over Andy's mix because Andy Wallace is Andy Wallace. And I sent it off, and they knew my work, and they said, well, that's pretty good, but we actually wanted it to be a little more X, Y, and Z. And I was like, oh shoot, well, that's what I would have done if I wasn't being careful, right? So that was really my last lesson, fairly recently, in being overly careful, based on who the client was, so I don't do that anymore. No matter who I get, what I get, I just do what I do, and then we're going to revise it if needed, and it's no big deal. It's not a problem. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I forget your question. I started rambling.
That's fine. Yes, we talked about you having a job and how you were able to, yeah.
So this is huge. So when I was in my early 20s, I was studying with Guitarcraft and with Robert Fripp, and he taught that it's like, making money from music is not a necessarily easy thing to do. It's also not necessarily a good thing to do, because if it's like a soul-crushing existence, and music is something that is near and dear to your heart, you love, why would you do that? Why would you kind of become a whore for a thing that you loved? So I always had a day job, and I really, really encourage people to do that. Again, the ego, the human ego wants to be like, oh, I'm a recording engineer, and like you're going to pick up girls with that. I don't know. Good luck. But you want to say I'm successful. I'm 25 and I'm doing something great. It's like, well, I hate to say it, but that is really shortchanging the potential of the person, because you're looking for the quick fix, and you don't really have enough of value at that stage. So you're going to work for somebody else, or you're going to fall into a pattern that's been predetermined by the market as it exists, by the world as it's structured, and you're going to be a cog in somebody's wheel. And again, if it's a good wheel, that can work. It can work, right? I'm not saying everybody needs to do what I did. You don't have to be me. You can be you. So if being the assistant for a famous mixer is good for you, that's fine. But you got two questions. One is, how are you going to leave? What's your exit strategy for that? Or are you going to do it forever? Are you always going to be the assistant? Maybe you are. If you don't always want to be the assistant, how are you going to get out of that? How are you going to transition out of that? Eventually you're going to have a strategy for that, right? And probably discuss it with your boss. But for me, it was like I kind of worked more in a vacuum, and then people heard what I did when it already had value, and they said, oh, maybe we pay you, $25 for that, or $50 for that, or whatever it was, So, there's a lot of ways to do it. Again, I'm not claiming to have any answers here about how anyone should go about living their life, but you kind of need to know what the different ups and downs, the positive and negative of each of these choices are. There isn't one best way, and every good way has some bad things to it, So, there aren't many assistant's job anymore, so that's probably a silly example, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, did you ever were you ever stressed, or did you question, will I be able to do this for a living? And, how was that? Did you feel that?
I didn't feel that, because I was simply, I was passionate about what I was doing. So I was driven not by being successful. Again, I think that's a kind of an egotistical thing that a lot of people fall into. It's like, again, the era we're in is so much pressure on folks, your age or younger than you, that are like, they're feeling like they have to like prove that they're worthy by being a success in their field right away. It's crazy. It's just crazy. So I was driven by sound. I was driven by tone. I was driven by quality of work. What drove me was that I wanted to be great for myself. And I'm also very competitive. Like, I think, pretty much everybody else sucks at my job. I still feel that way. I'm with all respect to all of them. And not every day do they suck, but by and large, I'll take a shootout with anyone on any day. And given a chance for revisions, I'm very confident I can win that because I'm very competitive. But I wasn't competitive initially against anyone else. I was competitive with myself to do the best that I could do, like to be the best that I could be. So being successful in some worldly measured way really wasn't on my radar. It was just about going for the tones in my head. It was the sounds that I heard. It was it's like you're a musician. You hear a song and you want to create it, or you hear a riff and you want to turn it into a song. And so for me as an engineer, I wanted to do engineering that was really great. That's what I wanted. I just wanted to be good. I wanted to be really, really good. And so the gear choices and the technical things that I experimented with and how I put together my chain and everything I did was because I kind of heard a sound in my head of mastering. After 99, when I started looking into mastering, and I was like, okay, well, Ludwig does some cool stuff, and Jensen's stuff sounds like that, and these guys sound like that, and those guys sound like that. And nobody really did on a regular basis what I heard, which is what you hear in my work. Like I heard a thing that I wanted to happen to my music in the mastering stage that wasn't available. And that's what I pursued. I pursued being able to consistently do that kind of what I thought was a cool thing. But I had a job. I had a couple of day jobs, and that allowed me the freedom to not so much worry about being successful. That just allowed me to buy stuff, and buying stuff was important because I'm a mostly analog desk guy. I mean, I use Sequoia and a couple of FabFilter plugins, but that's it. So I'm mostly in the analog world. So I mean, I have a simple setup now, but there was a day where I had so much stuff. I mean, I had two 2-inch machines I got from Pink Floyd. I had a console. I had a ton of outboard. I had a full production studio, mixing studio, and a mastering room, and it was all in my house. I had a lot of shit, and it was pretty expensive, let me tell you. And so was I driven by being successful? I mean, not the way you're meaning the word. So the success that I have now that people look at, to me, comes as a surprise along the lines of our original kind of conversation about, in life, you just have choices and you go along the path and you look back and it's a surprise. By the same token, it's kind of inevitable because my thing in music was never popularity. It was never hooks. It was always tone. It was always the vibe of the music. And so as a musician, I cared about what I care about as a mastering engineer.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's super interesting, man. And it's also really good to hear, because people my age, younger, maybe a bit older, it feels like there is a lot of pressure of, if you try something for a year or two and nothing happened, that means you fail, but that's not necessarily the case, I guess.
It's not the case. I mean, it's not the case in anything. I mean, look, if you want to be a doctor, what's it, like 10 years of school, and then you start. I mean, in the U.S. it is. I don't know the rest of the world, but yeah, in engineering, it's like, look, this is something that you can do really quickly and think that you're far along at it, but actually, that is a false sense of success. You can buy a computer. Of course, you own a computer. Everyone already has one. So you have a computer. You get your software. You get a handful of plugins. You get some preamps and a couple mics. And you're a recording engineer. You're a mixing engineer. You're a mastering engineer. Get you an ozone or whatever, which sounds like shit, but people use it. So you're an instant engineer. But here's the truth of it. Everybody else is that same place as you. And where you are is at the starting line on a career or a path or a craft, if you will. I think of it more of a craft. And craftsmanship takes years. It takes decades. And so it's a false sense of success when you can kind of get a little software and get some recording, and boom, you're like, I just put a recording up on the internet. I'm a recording engineer. It's like, well, this is an art form, and art is about quality. It's about taste. It's about subtlety. And those subtleties require a whole lot of work. So yeah, you do it. You did it. You just recorded and produced and mixed and mastered your own record. Congratulations. But so did a billion other people, or 100 million other people, or however, what is it, 1 million a day songs are on the internet or some crazy number.
Wow,
like
I didn't know that. Crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like 1 million songs a day. I don't know. Someone will look this up. If I'm wrong, they'll
yeah.
feel free to post in the comments.
Yeah.
But really, we're competing with music. We are truly competing against the recorded history of music. So you put a song out, you're competing against the recorded history of music. That's a big, big, big deal to kind of put your hat in the ring of that. So to think that you're just going to throw your hat in that ring and it's just going to catch fire and boom, boom, that would be kind of a silly thing to think. Right. So it's going to take time. And, what I say to people is what Robert said to me. If you don't need to do this gig, get out. Get out. Because it's a lifer thing. This is not a short-term deal. If you don't really need it, then you're doing the wrong thing. And that's okay. It's a trendy gig right now. A lot of people want this gig. It's very trendy. It wasn't trendy 20 years ago. Nobody'd heard of it. People thought I was nuts, when I was buying stuff. They're like, why don't you just go to that studio, Now everyone has a home studio. So there's so many elements of the era we're in that are really beautiful and powerful and amazing. And it's super cool. I love the democratization of music. I love that anybody can put stuff up, and I love all that. But we also have to be honest with ourselves about how easy it is to gain entry into an arena that is really, really, really competitive, and where you're competing against the recorded history of music, where a lot of things were done by groups of people with decades of experience working in collaborative teams. There's like you at home with your PreSonus and your Pro Tools or whatever. You can't really think that you're going to be in that world right away.
No. Yeah.
So it's tough. And I feel for people because, hey, I want everyone to have a fun job. I want everyone to do something cool. But, I used to deliver furniture. I used to wash dishes. I used to paint houses. These are honorable jobs. They're not glamorous jobs. But sadly, it's not just young people. I think it's the whole world at the moment, the Western world. People are too easily defined by what they do and not who they are. I'm 52, so I'm not old, but I'm older than half the planet, right? So it used to be that you had a job and then you were a person. And now people they vote and they think and they sort of do everything in line with their job. We've sort of lost in a lot of cases, not everybody. I'm being blanket general here, which is always dumb, right? But just to throw out a blanket thing, there's just this tendency to identify with what we do and to become that person. Like somebody used to work at GM and make cars, and they'd come home and they might vote Republican even though they were in a Democratic-leaning union. Now, not many people. Most of those union people probably voted Democratic. But you get what I'm saying. There was a distinction between the person and their career or money-making. And that has really become blurred and lost in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, people are trying to really dive into the career as an identity. And what cooler identity than being a mixer or a producer or, recording engineer doesn't sound very sexy, but that's a cool career. If you can get those gigs only. But, mastering, that sounds really, master. Sounds like you're like the master of the universe, right? That sounds very impressive, right? Those guys must know something, or that girl must really have her shit together. She's a mastering engineer. So these gigs are very alluring on the ego front. And like I said, entry is pretty easy. You can get in pretty cheap, pretty quick, and you can do a decent job. It's not hard. to do a good job. It's just hard to do a great job. And I think it's important that people give themselves a break and maybe, you know, sort of check their ego at the door and look at what you're kind of competing with. It's the recorded history of music. It's a big curve. And so, you know, be kind to yourself, give yourself a break. And if you don't really need this life, you know, there's a lot of other things that are great to do, and you can make music on the weekends. You can always record. It doesn't have to be for money. It can be a hobby. You know, it's a great hobby. I think making music is the best hobby. Makes people smarter, makes community. It's relaxing. It takes stress and anger out of people when they can make music. I mean, I'd like everybody to have the hobby of making music, but the actual career of making music is a whole other thing. And for me, I entered it kind of reluctantly. You know, I mean, not obviously now it's what I do, but when I entered it, I had this, you know, I had other gigs, and so I sort of transitioned over reluctantly, knowing that I was now dependent on the, you know, the system, if you will, you know, the commercial system of music is now, I'm in that, right? So before I let myself become part of that wheel, I made sure that I had a pretty good handle on the value of what I was doing, and also that I was really passionate about it, that I really needed to do it, you know, because you give up a lot when you put yourself in the hands of the music business.
Yeah, totally, man.
It's not a terrible thing to do, but it's a big leap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very well put, you know. So thanks for that. It's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I want everybody to be successful. Don't get me wrong, and maybe everybody can be, but maybe they can't. It's each person has to assess it, you know. But it's just, I think it's important to know, to really begin by being real about what's the arena we're working in, and where are we in that arena, you know, and to give ourselves a break, and to not be so hard on ourselves, you know, and just sort of give things some time, you know.
Yeah, that's really good advice, man. But so nowadays, when, you know, with your mastering studio, the just lost the name of the Magic Garden Mastering. I'm really curious about how you're running your business nowadays. How do you balance it so you don't go crazy and, you know, stay creative?
Yeah, well, it's not hard for me, because I've been doing it long enough that I've, you know, sort of evolved into a schedule and a way of working that works for me. So, you know, it used to take me 3 weeks to do a record. Now I can do a record in an hour, you know. So, in terms of time, you know, it's intense focus for less time, in terms of the work time. And then in terms of organizing my day, I you know, I do administrative, you know, emails, fixes, you know, that kind of stuff. I do that in the sort of the daylight hours. And then I generally do, not always, this is a general, but I generally do the kind of new passes, you know, what you might call creative work, or some would argue it's not creative, but I'll call it creative work, in the dark, in the evening hours, you know, like after 8 or 10 p.m. So it's not hard for me. I mean, I guess the hard thing is when you're successful in a self-employed field, the hardest thing is just figuring out how to take time off, you know. I mean, I took yesterday off all day, and that was a big deal. You know, if I take 4 days off, that's a big deal. 2-week vacation, haven't had one in 20 years.
Right. Would you like to have one?
I would like to have one, and I'm working up to it. I've had it on the list, and it's moved near the top of the list. But yeah, I would like to take 2 weeks and do some other things, you know.
But is that also down to fear of missing work, or is it just too much work to do?
Well, yeah, it's a momentum business, you know. It's being a mastering engineer in this era. I sort of liken it to being an emergency room doctor. You know, people call and they're like, "Hey, we got a broken leg. Can you fix it?" And if you can't fix it, someone else is going to fix it. So there's momentum. And if you're not around for 4 days, well, that's okay. you're not around for 2 weeks, that's maybe okay too. I mean, some people's schedules are different than mine. My schedule is like, I just have continual work coming in and I get it in and out really quickly, because as an engineer, I try to represent what I wanted as an artist, and I wanted to get the stuff back pretty quickly. I didn't want to wait around a long time, and so I try to give that to people. I mean, 2 days, 5 days, somewhere between there, 2 to 5 is normal. Occasionally it's the same day, occasionally it's over 5 days. But normally not. I mean, I don't know. I'd have to think about this answer, but not more than a week. I mean, so I like to keep it in within a week. So I enjoy, selfishly, the momentum of get it in, get it out. Get approval or get a revision. Okay, get the revision out. So every day I'll do my revisions before I do the new work. The revisions don't make money, but the revisions keep the people happy who are waiting on the revision. And I put myself in their shoes, So I want to do new work every day, but I also want to get the revisions out, because I don't want anybody who's unhappy to be sitting around unhappy for any longer than is necessary. Again, that's putting myself in the shoes of the artist, the producer, the client, So yeah, I just try to treat people the way that I wanted to be treated at the time. I want great work. I want it pretty quick. I want revisions to be easy, and I want the whole exchange to feel, kind of positive and uplifting and exciting, to build momentum into the release, because releasing music is, going back to what we talked about, it triggers the insecurity. It's tricky. I've said this in other interviews and other places, so I'm kind of quoting myself, but you've got this thing that you thought you were going to make, and then you release it, and then it becomes what the world will judge you by forever. So it goes from this dream that you kind of make in private, of this thing you imagine, and then one day it becomes judged and permanent and fixed, and that's a big deal. And mastering sits at that threshold between what we thought we were going to make and what the world will, decide that we did, and it becomes a historical record at that point. So, I don't like to make people suffer at that threshold, because when I was an artist, I didn't want to suffer at that threshold. I want to make an experience that helps people kind of feel good and be excited about the release.
Yeah, totally. Which makes sense.
So back to your point of taking time off, it's like, selfishly, I like my job. I like my work. I like to make people happy. I like to get it in and out. I like to upgrade music. It feels good to do. So, 4 or 5 days off, I mean, I'm ready to do it again. Like, can I stretch myself and go 2 weeks? I don't know, because again, it's kind of very selfish. I mean, I guess a bit of it is a fear component, but mostly it's just I like to do it, But I might like to. Maybe 2 weeks is too much to ask. Let me revise that. Let's just do a week. I'm just gonna restate that.
Yeah,
I'm gonna work towards a week.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
Where would you go for that week? Do you have a place in mind?
Yeah, like Tulum, Mexico is where I like to go.
Oh yeah, how come?
Yeah, it's cool down there. It's like
You've been
kind of
before.
Yeah, it's like bohemian chic, and there's snorkeling and beautiful water and good food, and it's not overbuilt, and it's kind of a good international mix of people. Yeah, I like Tulum.
Nice, man. I've never been to Mexico, but I'd love to go actually.
Well, there's a lot of places there. I've never been to the other places, but that's the place that I like to go.
Nice, man. Yeah, I'll check it out. So, do you have a favorite failure, as in something that's set you up for later success?
Oh, that's a good one. I think so. I mean, I already sort of said the one, but that was a small failure, like sending out a pass and being conservative. Back in like 90 something, 8, 7, can't remember, but Daniel Lanois came through town when I was living in Columbus, and I gave him a CD that I had done, I don't think I did the mastering on it. I don't think I was doing any real mastering then, but it was some music that I'd written and performed and had a hand in the recording. I don't think I recorded all of it. I'm trying to think out loud as I talk. I don't think I recorded all of it. I don't think I mixed it. I definitely didn't have anything to do with the mastering. But it was I had a lot of respect. I do have a lot of respect for him. And at the time, I was excited to kind of give this to him. I don't know why. I don't know what I was trying to get out of that. It's a weird thing, giving people your music. It's like if they don't ask for it, it's a strange thing. So, I think it was just kind of an innocent kind of a, hey, do you want to hear my music? Sort of like a joyful naivete. But as soon as I handed it to him, I knew it was a mistake, and it wasn't a mistake because he would think it would suck or whatever, which could have been. I don't know. That's not where I was feeling. My intuition told me that it just wasn't the best I could do. And I was raised by like two artists and a non-artist. So my mom is an artist professionally. She's an interior designer. And my dad, who left when I was 3, he was an artist. He was an actor and a performer. And then my stepdad, who I grew up with my mom, not an artist. He's a, good person, but not an artistic person. But the main thing that popped in my head in that moment was like, there was a certain impatience or ambition or a sense of rushing that I shouldn't have shared that with him. And I knew it immediately. It didn't have anything to do with him hearing it or saying he liked it or didn't like it or hated it or whatever. It wasn't that. It was just that I knew it wasn't my best. And I was brought up to kind of always do your best, whatever that meant. And I realized in that moment that there was a sense of either, ambition, like I say, or impatience or just excitement, like youthful, exuberant excitement, or there was something where I just was getting in the way of me really doing my best. And I knew it was a mistake, and I regretted it immediately. And I think it really impacted the next couple of years as I continued to learn engineering and sort of teach myself again. In that era, there wasn't a whole lot of online anything. There wasn't any online anything. So that I think that was a really big mistake, and I used it to kind of slow down and really kind of to stop looking for the world to validate what I do. I was looking for him to somehow validate what I did. I don't know how. I don't know why. I mean, I do know why, but I don't know how. I mean, I don't know what I expected. I've honestly no idea what I expected. It was kind of a dumb thing to do. But it was a good thing to do because it was a mistake that I realized that external validation doesn't matter. It's nice. We all love it, right? It's nice when people email and say, "Oh, I love your work. I can't wait to do my, can't wait for you to do my work." That's nice. But you can't live off of that. You can't eat that for dinner. What you can eat for dinner is that you've done the work and that it's good and you've done your best. And if you drop dead tomorrow, you're fine with that because you've done the best you can do to the highest standard that not a perfectionistic standard, but a musical standard. And you're satisfied with yourself. You have a sense of peace that you've done your thing, And in that moment, I felt I hadn't done that. And so after that, I was like, okay, let's never do that again. Let's not do that again. And it was probably another 15 years before I made, really what I consider another big mistake, which was the thing I mentioned earlier, which was like sending out tracks because it was a famous engineer that I had respected when I was younger and not just doing what I do. So those two are kind of, you put those together and those are good learning experiences for me.
Yeah, that makes sense, man. But you mentioned, doing your best, that's what matters. And I myself do some exercises. I know there are exercises where you can, write down, what you did good for the day. Is that something you do yourself to?
Oh, like those sort of like affirming kind of things, the positive affirmation.
Yeah, sort of. It's, yeah, you call it affirming
Yeah, I mean,
stuff.
I don't do that. I have developed kind of like when I'm in the studio, like I say, it used to take 3 weeks to do a record. Now I could do it in an hour. It doesn't mean that I'm trying to be faster. It just means that inevitably I hit the standard or the target that I know is, from experience of doing it over and over. I know when I'm done. I'm like, okay, I'm done now. It's time to send it out. And maybe they'll love it, or maybe I'll get a revision, but I'm done. So my daily thing of what you're saying is really just, it happens in the moment of doing the work. While I'm working, I'm always asking myself two questions. Can I let it go? And what does it need? And you're trying to balance. You're trying to balance, again, being respectful and being disrespectful. Being conservative and being liberal. You're trying to find that middle ground where you're doing the necessary things, not too many, not too few. Again, going back to honor necessity, what's needed, honor sufficiency, how much is enough. And that relates to really an internal standard that we all have to develop over time. This is the thing that takes time. This internal conversation of how much is enough, and do I go further? And so when I hear other people's mastering work, I'm always thinking, well, either they didn't do enough or they went too far. You know what I mean? Because I think about other people's work the way I think about my work. You can be too conservative and too close to the mix, and then it's not really alive. Or you can go too far. Maybe your room's weird, or maybe your aesthetic is weird, and it ends up sounding like a neon billboard, or it ends up sounding, like cardboard, or whatever it is that people do. Whether I judge myself or other people, I always use the same standard. It's that balance between, doing enough and doing too much.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense, man. So before we wrap up here, could you let the listeners know where they can find more about you? If you have a website and all
Sure,
that sort
sure.
of things.
Yeah, of course. So it's magicgardenmastering.com, and you can go to All Music and punch in Brian Lucey and see pretty good list of credits there, at least over the last 10 or 15 years. And I work in every style every day. I would like to do sort of more pop and hip hop. I've because of doing the Black Keys, which was a great record, Brothers. There's like a naturalism to a lot of the music I get, which I'm totally fine with. I like it. I enjoy it. But I like to do every style. I like to enhance everything. I personally don't have a preference, but stylistically you will see an angle to my catalog, particularly to the more known records. There's a lot of records I do for unknown people that don't end up being credited. I mean, I have 50 clients a month, so you're talking 600 people a year, and there aren't 10 years of credits. There aren't 6,000 people there, so a lot of people are just getting going, and I price on a scale to help people out. And
So
yeah, I
anyone
like
can contact you for
I like
work.
every style. Yeah, just email. My assistant Kate or I will respond, and we work it out with everybody. And I do all the work. Kate is actually back in Ohio, and I'm in Los Angeles for the last 6 years. But yeah, so we're available online, mostly every day. And I work with all styles and people at all levels of success. A few very famous, and the kind of pyramid goes down to a whole lot of people who are just getting going. And that's about it.
Nice. Yeah, I put the links to that in the description so people can find you there. But awesome, Brian. Thank you very much for being on the podcast. It was awesome talking to you.
Well, thanks for having me. It was fun to talk with you, and some good questions in there. I enjoyed it, and I could really tell you did your homework.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate that. Thanks again for coming on to the podcast, Brian. Pleasure talking to you, and I hope you, the listener, enjoyed it as well. Don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast. It would really help spread the word and get some more cool guests coming on. And before you leave, don't forget to check out the free guide in the description below. 3 tested ways to increase your client base. Perfect if you are a home studio owner or work in a professional studio but want to increase your client base. So check it out, link below, and yeah, don't forget to subscribe, share, all those sort of things, and I'll see you soon.